I met Anne on Twitter, which was a pretty extraordinary experience. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter, but one night while I was in the process of writing my current book, late at night, really bored, trying to keep myself awake, I just sent this Twitter out into the universe, really just kind of distracting myself. And the tweet said, "Who would like to see Sam Heughan play a Scottish miner in the screen adaptation of The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka?" And I included Anne's Twitter handle because Anne was my favourite Outlander writer, and I followed her on Twitter. And lo and behold, the next morning, there was a reply from Anne. And I was just completely gobsmacked, and I went into a kind of fangirl meltdown and squealed for quite some time, and then pulled myself together, remembered that I was an associate professor of history at La Trobe University, and responded to Anne, who had said, "Is this a fantasy, or is this actually happening? I haven't heard of this book, sounds interesting. What's the story?" And from there we started corresponding with each other, and after a while it felt like I had the pen pal that I'd always wanted at 14 and had never had. And it sort of all moved from there. I'd like to say quickly, but it wasn't actually. It was quite slowly.
No, I actually was looking, I have a journal, and I looked in the back of it, and it was a year ago I was writing about, I wonder how we would do this and how could we break it down. So it's taken a while to make it all happen, for sure. I had just finished up at Outlander. I did the first 3 seasons, and I was kind of looking around for things to do, and I saw her tweet about, who would like to see Sam Heughan in this, in The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. Of course, my first thought is, I have no control over Sam Heughan, so that's going to be a bit of a disappointment, but it sounded interesting, so I asked her what the book was and what was happening with it, and she said that she had sold it and that there was a production company involved. So at that point I sort of figured, oh well, okay, they probably got a writer, and of course it's going to be an Australian writer, and so I asked some version of, well, who's writing it, and she responded with some version of, I don't know, you? And so it was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And we started to correspond on Twitter message. My daughter at one point said, "Mom, she's grooming you." Very funny. But yeah, I think we really enjoyed each other's sensibilities and sense of humor, and so I asked her to send me the book. At that point, I still wasn't sure who she was, so I had her send it to my husband's office, just in case she was like some crazy person or something.
Stalking historian.
Yes, stalking me from Australia. I don't know what I thought was going to happen. Anyway, so I read the book, and it's terrific. And I think sometimes when I hear Claire talk about her book, I think she undersells herself a little bit as a writer, because it isn't just about the story and bringing these women forward. She writes it in such a compelling way. The characters seem like real people. You have a very kind of sassy point of view. There's a real voice there. So it made it really fun to read. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, we started going back and forth to try to figure out, well, how could we do this? Could we really do it? And it took some jiggering back and forth, but we finally made it happen. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited to get a chance to do this.
It's incredible to imagine that we could make a product like Outlander out of my book. Certainly when you sit down to write a book, you don't think this might become a television series. I wrote my book in quite a novelistic style, but that's because I like to write in scenes, and I like my stories to be character-driven, and it's very much narrative-led drama rather than it's very much narrative-led historical writing rather than argument-driven, which a lot of academic writing is. So I think that there's rich pickings for a drama series, but it certainly hadn't ever been part of my conception. The Outlander connection is interesting because clearly I'm a huge fan of Outlander, particularly the first series, which to me was in some ways the most intellectual of the series. It was the one that to me had most epistemological elements to it that were about the concept of time and about how we know the past and about that really interesting idea of being able to change the future because you know the past. And so for me, that's really, I think, what drew me in. And secondly, the thing I loved about Outlander was that it was female-led drama. There was not a scene, I don't think, that didn't have Claire, the main character, in it. So we saw everything through her eyes. And that really knocked me for a six, because I didn't think I'd ever seen any television like that before. So for me, it was really kind of inspirational in terms of the way that I thought about how history might be able to be realised and represented on screen, which it very much hasn't been in the past. But I don't think that any television adaptation of The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka will just be Outlander in Ballarat. Yeah. I don't think that any of us are thinking about it that way. I think there are elements of what worked in Outlander that might work for us. Yeah. But it's not like, let's take that formula and then make it Australian style. Like, it's not a MasterChef franchise, you know?
Doing Outlander, I think, certainly gave me the opportunity to write historical fiction and historical drama, which I had not done before. So in that regard, I feel more comfortable. Well, okay, I can do it over here too, but obviously it's 100 years later, and so it's very different. It'll be a very different thing. It's, again, will be many female characters, not just one. But I think the things I've certainly learned from it is, yeah, you want people to have strong feelings. I love romance, and sex is great, so we certainly will try to, because all those things humanize people. They become, instead of just sort of a one-dimensional political or polemic idea, you really feel like, wow, these are people, they're like me. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And as you say, I think it's a way to sort of popularize and reach out to people a little more and help them understand a continuum. And it doesn't even it's not just if you're Australian, it's anybody. And so many of these people came from all these different places. We have an American character, we have women from Ireland and Scotland. Yeah, so I think it's, humanizing them and making them fuller is something I learned in Outlander, and I certainly will apply to this.
So the screen rights to my book were purchased by Ruby Entertainment, a fantastic Melbourne production company who are best known and loved for television shows like Kath and Kim and Full Frontal and Fast Forward. But more recently they've moved into drama, and the last thing Ruby did was The Secret River, adaptation of Kate Grenville's novel, which I just absolutely loved what they did with that. So I was really thrilled when they wanted to acquire the rights to my book. And so that happened a couple of years ago, 2015. And then the next stage is the hard part, which is trying to raise the development funds to be able to go the next step, which is to actually get a treatment and a pilot script written. And sometimes you can get that development fund from networks, but that's actually becoming harder and harder to acquire as places like the ABC in Australia have their funding slashed and slashed and slashed. And so I took the slightly unorthodox route of applying to the university, to my employer, La Trobe, for funding through their Strategic Innovation Fund, which is for research commercialisation. And I think when they set up that fund, they had in mind things like commercialising biotech and maybe computer info stuff, I don't even know the word for it, info stuff, and drug patents and things like that. You know, it's science research that usually gets commercialised. But I had an opportunity to take my product to market, to use very bold terms for what's going on. And so I applied, and it took a while to fit my square peg into their round holes. But I was really thrilled that there was a lot of goodwill, and I had to pitch before a committee and make an extensive application and receive the funding through La Trobe. And that seed funding is what has allowed us to take the next step, which is to employ a writer to write the pilot script. And then once the pilot script is written, then you can take that to networks who will then look to commission the program. And there are already some that are interested. They just want to see the pilot script. And when the pilot script is written by someone like Anne Kenny, they want to see it even quick smarter.
Coming here and meeting Claire and meeting Mark Roos at Ruby and really talking about the whole process definitely makes it seem real. One of the things that I really appreciate about working with Claire and with Mark is that they're really open to, and particularly Claire, because you're the historian, open to making things up and, again, combining characters and doing it a little differently. Sometimes when you're working on something that has a technical component and you have a technical advisor, they can be real sticklers for, no, that could never happen. And it's very frustrating when you're writing. So I was delighted when we started to talk that Claire's super open to, making things up, filling in gaps. I don't think we're going to do anything outrageous. We're not going to make anybody an alien at this point, I don't think. But it's terrific to have, and I feel like I have the book in life that I can, call up or write to her and say, well, what might happen in this situation? Well, what if we put her here? What's going to happen? It's just enormously helpful, and it does seem very real now, absolutely.
I guess for me, the frustration of being an historian, and don't get me wrong, I love being an historian. I still thank my stars every day that I get paid to do what I love. You're a lucky person indeed if that's the case. But my frustration is that often I would like to let my imagination take flight. Because as an historian, I can only stick to the evidence. So if I can't find documentation that something happened, I can't say it happened. And this book took me 10 years to write. I was immersed in the archive. I spoke to descendants of people who were at Eureka. And so I had a pretty good feel for a lot of things that were going on. I have a sense of who the alliances would have been between, where the animosities would have lay, and say, for example, who might have been in the same room with who at what time. But if I haven't got evidence to say that, if I can't point to the newspaper article or the letter or the diary entry or the court report that says those two people were in the room, I can't write it down. That's my pact with my reader. You don't make shit up. And so what's really exciting about this is now I get to follow some of my hunches, some of my intuition, some of my more creative storytelling urges to be able to put people in rooms with each other, to be able to invest them with an interior life, to have an emotional response to particular situations that I might have wanted them to have as characters, but I can't say that they have if I haven't got actually that evidence base. So I kind of feel like I'm off the leash, and it's pretty fun.
Part of what I was doing when I was here was to go to visit Ballarat, and we went to Sovereign Hill to see kind of where the places were that this took place. Obviously, it looks completely different. But Sovereign Hill is fun because it gives you some sense of what it must have been like. And it's very helpful. I mean, it's helpful to just be in a place and look around and imagine, what did this look like? And what did they think when they first saw it? And even at Sovereign Hill, looking at the tents they were living in and how did that digging of those mines work? We've been laughing because I keep saying, did they have a formula? Did they have divining rods? Like, it's a big empty place. How do you know where to dig? And you only get to dig in this one little spot. So that part is fascinating to me. I think that's really cool. So it's very helpful to be there and see what it looks like. And then also we've looked at a lot of artwork from that period, which is also extremely helpful to just kind of imagine. Because as I'm writing it, I need to picture where are these people and what does this look like. So although we'll also hopefully have a production designer, so they'll give us a lot of that too.
And we saw the flag?
Yes, which was very cool. We saw the Eureka flag, or what's left of it. And it's it's a very inspiring and moving experience to see that and to imagine these women who stitched it together and what it meant to all of those people, and also looking at the book we looked at yesterday and just touching the paper and thinking, wow, the person who wrote this touched this paper. It's kind of a surreal experience. So that's all been, really great. I think it'll all inform as I go forward.
Like many Outlander fans, it was the wedding episode that completely cemented, firstly, my love of Outlander, and secondly, my respect for Anne as a writer. It was just such an incredible hour of television. I actually would like to say the perfect hour of television. And so to have spent this last 2 weeks with Anne, working on an adaptation of my book, is actually quite surreal. It's been a huge learning curve for me. I've written for television before, but I've written documentaries. So to be able to be thinking about a dramatic adaptation of my book, which is a non-fiction history book, it has been really exciting, really fun, super fun. As I've said to Anne, it feels like playing a lot of the time. You know, it's been kind of kids in a sandbox going, and what if we, and then we could, and what do you think, and bouncing off each other. And that's completely different from the way that academics work, you know, cloistered in our little offices and writing late into the night and writing our own research papers, and it's a lonely and often isolated existence, and to have this kind of collaborative interaction has just been so satisfying, and to have it with somebody who is so at the top of her game and has so much that I have so much to learn from her.
I finished reading the book. I just felt like, wow, this would be such a great opportunity. It does have such great women characters. And one of the things I like about it is there are so many. In fact, part of the challenge we've had is to kind of winnow it down, or to, you know, make people composites, put a couple of people together. Because I think sometimes it's great to have a female-led drama, for sure. What's lovely is when there's more than one female voice. Because sometimes, I know in the writer's room, for instance, if there's one woman in the writer's room, it starts to feel like you're speaking for our entire gender, you know, as if there's only one point of view. And so one of the really fun things about this story is there are so many women in it, and we're able to really have very different points of view to say, not only were they there, but they're as individual as the men. And they all had different wants, and whether they accomplished them or not. So that just felt like a great field to play. I love historical drama, so it was really fun to think about, you know, setting it in this mining community. It's a little intimidating because I knew nothing about any of this. This was all brand new information to me. So I've been on a very steep learning curve trying to take in as much as I can without getting completely overwhelmed. So
it's really wonderful to think, for me, that these women who are the characters in my book might become characters in a television drama series, because they were real women. They led these lives. Anne and I had a fantastic experience yesterday of going to the State Library and looking at the diary that was written by one of the women who will be a character in this show. And she was there on the spot, and she was writing a diary of her occasion. I actually feel a great deal of responsibility towards those women, firstly to have told their story at all in a book, and that was my intention in the first place. To write a revisionist history of Eureka was about including the women in the story who had always been left out of that telling. When I went through school, when my kids went through school, they learnt about Eureka as a place that only men participated in. And therefore, as an event that was supposed to be the birth of Australian democracy, that means that foundation story that we're all taught about is gendered male. And therefore, the values and the characteristics that come out of it, things like unity, collectivity, fighting for your rights, fighting for your freedoms, sticking by your mates, all of those sort of things that we take back to Eureka, those are all qualities that are gendered male when there are only men in the story. And girls internalise that stuff, you know, they internalise the idea of who it is who makes history. And that, I think, has repercussions for their own lives, for their own sense of agency today. So that might be seeming to draw a long bow, but I think it's a case that can be made. So for these women who were actually there, to then be written back into the scholarly version of the story that may get into education, which I think is a great thing. But then for it to go one step further and go into popular culture, well, that's amazing, because just the audience reach is just so much, you know, exponentially further. And so that's a really exciting prospect for me, politically as much as creatively.